So I've been thinking about the two historians, Herodotus and Thucydides, for, as I say, well over 40 years. And I want to start, I think, by saying three things that I hope are salient that you could take away from the ramble I'm going to give you of how the ideas in the Arethusa paper of 1987 developed. One is the centrality for my whole career thinking about these two historians, rhetoric. I'm going to talk about having taken a wonderful seminar with Helen North in college at Swarthmore. And there we read in Greek a lot of Aristotle's rhetoric. It was the first text in Greek I ever read that I really enjoyed. And I thought the Greek made sense in a way that English translations don't. So I encourage everybody, if you haven't done it, the Greek of the rhetoric is a lot of fun. But in chapter 2 of book 1, he makes the point that the whole purpose of a construction of a rhetorical piece, of a piece that's meant to persuade or convince your it. And then he takes it up again in book 2 and again in book 3, just how important it is for the person learning to write a kind of prose that convinces somebody of that what you need to do is construct a persona that is convincing. The second thing that I hope you can take away from this ramble is the importance in historiography of Bakhtin's idea of dialogism and the accompanying and kind of mysterious quality of heteroglossia. It came into English scholarship in, I think, 1975. I don't read Russian, and I'm going to give an anecdote, a very Herodotian anecdote of how I discovered the centrality of the historians to Bakhtin's thinking. But I think that are very, very important for our understanding of historiography, of how people write historical narratives. And then the third thing I'd like to say just generally is in 2002, I put into the Brill volume that Egbert Bakker, Irina de Jong, and Hans von Wies published, the Brill Herodotus, an article entitled, "I Didn't Give My Own Genealogy, Herodotus in the Authorial Persona." And that actually has most of my later thoughts kind of reassessing this notion that you've read about in the 1987 piece. I simplify things quite a bit. I hope I can talk about that in my 30 minutes. But and I also give there a lot of the bibliography that has been most important for me since the publication of the 1987 piece, both narratologists and historiographers working on Herodotus's history. And I see some of you here, Roger Brock, I see, great to see you. Nobody else emerging on my screen has been working specifically on the first person persona, but maybe there's several other screens. Anyway, welcome to all of you, and I'm just I'll plunge ahead. Anyway, those are the three things that I think are most interesting. How did this piece happen? Well, I was very lucky in the mid-1960s to go to Swarthmore College. And I should say it was a frightening experience because I was from a little town in Northwest Washington State. And back then, many cultures that were quite distinctive in the US. And I appeared at Swarthmore in a homemade polka-dotted dress with a red sailor hat and red shoes and a red purse. And I was the only person in the freshman class who wasn't wearing jeans. The East Coast was already very much into the Beat generation and thereafter. And I was really at sea. And what saved my sanity in this very, it was frightening, but you know, politically engaged, which I loved. And SNCC, one of the founders of SNCC, was a Swarthmore person. And we had people from the John Birch Society, the far right-wing society, actually lurking on our campus to make sure that these communists weren't going to overthrow the government. So it was exciting times. In my junior year in high school, John Kennedy had been shot. And in my senior year in college, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were shot that spring. So for me, political action, how do you become a citizen? How do you decide to show up as a person with integrity in a system that is corrupt and a system that is falling down? Those were real questions, and Martin Ostwald and Helen North were ideal teachers for someone who wanted to ask those questions of the Greek ancient world. So Martin, I probably owe more to Martin than any other individual in terms of just my formation. He was a wonderful teacher and amazing scholar. I babysat him, and he and his wife would come home, and he would have been reminded of something in Homer, and then he would quote several hundred lines of the Iliad, and I would pretend I understood what he was talking about. He was just an absolutely remarkable man with a huge open heart, and he loved Plato. I worked with him on a senior project in the Republic, and Plato disappointed me. I never did figure out, and I don't have a philosophical mind, but Plato, I agree with Nettleship that Plato did not adequately think through how individuals with a tripartite mind, most of them could subordinate the highest part of their mind to obedience to a guardian. I just didn't ever figure out how the tripartite state and the tripartite human being work together. But in the political philosophy seminar I took with Ostwald, we read enough Thucydides that I knew I wanted to read Thucydides in graduate school. The North seminar, the seminar I took with Helen North, was even more profoundly shaping my intellectual aspirations. We read certainly about Odysseus in book 3 of the Iliad, where his words come down like snow. We read the Phaedrus, we read Aristotle's Rhetoric, we read Demetrius, Dionysius, the Ad Herennium. You know, in literary criticism at the time, and I didn't take any English courses, but I had a very good English teacher in high school. We were still sort of in the throes of T.S. Eliot's dictum that you cannot know the author from the work. You simply aren't entitled to make a biography of somebody out of what they say in print. And that's of course true. But it's also true that you have to acknowledge, as Aristotle did, that the individual writer constructs for you a persona using his or her later, but of course it's all his in our context here. His speaking voice or writing voice is what conveys the common sense or the trustworthiness or the openness or the ability to use logic or the ability to rely on facts, whatever it is that he wants to convey, it has to be conveyed by a certain kind of construction of his language. And that was very valuable. So I went off to Berkeley in 1969 to study further, and I knew I wanted to study Thucydides more. I didn't know I would end up spending half a life on Thucydides, but I knew I wanted to learn more because I loved that voice. I loved what he was at these very troubled times that we were in. And I should say the Berkeley Classics Department in the early 70s was a very active place. John Dillon was a senior graduate student, and he got us all organized to promote peace candidates out at Livermore, where they built the bomb. And I would go out, I had very long hair, sort of Joan Baez style, and I would wear the clothes my mother had sent me and put my hair up in a bun and go man a little table where we passed out material on peace candidates. And all these people kept coming around and taking our pictures, and I just thought it was the local throwaway paper. And I didn't realize until quite a bit later that I had compiled quite a fat FBI file as a dangerous radical trying to undermine the government. I tried to get it, but they they take out so much of the material that it's not very interesting when you get your file. But in any case, I took a wonderful seminar from Ron Stroud and Kendrick Pritchett. It lasted a year in Thucydides. And Pritchett had walked, I still have a great deal of trouble calling him Kendrick Pritchett. I will probably call him Mr. Pritchett in the course of this talk. But he had walked all of Greece, and he brought to our seminar on Thucydides just an amazing topographical interest, and of course, both of them amazing epigraphic interest. And both for the paper I wrote for them and then the dissertation that I wrote on Thucydides, I had to be very Thucydidean in my accounting for Thucydidean rhetoric. They were not at all people inclined to accept large impressionistic ideas about their author. So I had to be quite specific. And what I came up with was a dissertation that tried to look at the units of action that Thucydides uses to compose his history. And it was very interesting. Once I could quantify to the satisfaction of Pritchett and Stroud, and then I had as a third reader Rafe Seeley in the history department. Once I could quantify it, I discovered to my astonishment that actually in book 6, Thucydides undertakes an entirely different way of ordering his narrative. And so I wrote up the dissertation with that, little point in mind. Well, not so little, but it was a point about the rhetoric of Thucydides that I got a dissertation from, and I was supposed to write a book if I ever was going to, get a job and get tenure. And I should say, before I finished that dissertation, my then husband was a French historian, and we spent about 2 years all told in France, where I met a number of classicists, and I was exposed to an entirely different way of thinking about classics than what we knew at Berkeley. The Vernon School was starting and was very exciting. Vernon and Détienne, both fascinating anthropological approaches to classics. And also I learned about the Russian formalists. I did quite a bit of just reading for fun in Propp and Jakobson and people like that. But the most important author I engaged with was Bakhtin. As I said, I can only read him in English or French, but it was revolutionary to me in the late 70s to be thinking through the idea Bakhtin promotes of dialogism and heteroglossia. And here I want to become Herodotus for a minute and just tell an anecdote, because it's one of the most astonishing things that happened in my scholarly life. I happened to be on a fellowship at Vassar College in 2002, and really trying to put together finally the book out of the Thucydides dissertation that I had written many years before. I had lunch with a colleague, Vasily Rudich, who was Russian himself. And I said, Vasily, I just don't understand it. Why on earth hasn't Bakhtin? It seems to me that Herodotus and Thucydides are really where heteroglossia becomes a functional concept. This notion of taking everybody's story and everybody's ideologue or idiolect and put it into an ongoing account that is the composite of many voices. And Vasily looked at me and said, well, I studied with Bakhtin. He'd studied with Bakhtin when he was released from the concentration camp and was, he was ill by that point. But according to Vasily, at the point where he studied with him, there was a KGB minder in the corner, but fortunately she was an alcoholic, so she would pass out. And they would pass little strips of paper back and forth between themselves across the desk, and Bakhtin would smoke his pipe and burn the little pieces of paper in his pipe And in those pieces of paper, Bakhtin said, yes, that the actual inspiration for what he calls dialogism was in reading the historians, in particular Herodotus, but that he had, of course, he couldn't write about it because the official religion of Soviet Union was Marxist historiography. And his notions are very different. This notion of a text that is many people's voice, out of which a negotiated meaning arises, not on the part of the author, but on the part of the collision or communication between the different voices, that he couldn't publish that in the Soviet Union. In fact, I got so excited, I got up and hopped around the table like an idiot, but it was, I don't know if it's true, obviously, but legatai, it's a wonderful possibility that's really where the notion of constructing a text that is everybody's story, and that out of the decisions of multiple people come certain actions that lead to further actions that lead to further decisions, all of that. That notion was one he arrived at by reading our historians, and then the only place he could publish it would be in talking about people like Aristophanes and Homer. So I loved that idea. In classics, narratology and reader response theory was becoming very popular. I know that I was much influenced by Bob Connor's reader response, Thucydides. And I decided in about 1977 to turn to Herodotus and just see what he was about before trying to publish the Thucydides work that was still sitting on my desk. And Herodotus was a terrifying author at first. He seemed totally different from Thucydides in the way he went about constructing his narrative. I spent about a year just reading and rereading the histories and not being able to figure out what he was doing. I wasn't willing to go back to the, oh, he's the guy who hangs out on the quays and just, talks to people and says whatever he wants. I didn't think that was true. But, the kind of text he was constructing and the kind of authority that he wanted that text to have were not at all obvious to me. So I began to make note cards, and I have 3 big shoe boxes full of note cards, about 1,500 note cards that I wrote in a very Thucydidean way. I wanted acrobaia. I wanted to be knowing that I was dealing with a real phenomenon. So I made cards of all the places where Herodotus used the first person. And I should say very shortly after, starting this project, I made the acquaintance of Don Lateiner, and his work has been very, very influential for me as, talking about Herodotus as someone who is a serious historian and using his rhetoric to convey history. We swapped back and forth note cards for several years. And then in 1986, Debbie Bodeker invited me to Holy Cross, to the remarkable conference from which the Arethusa volume came. And there's a lot of wonderful articles in that volume. That's a tremendous place where lots of people started realizing that they were thinking about Herodotus in an entirely different way from where we had been before. And so the article that I wrote there is, well, I should say I wrote, in order to get tenure, I wrote a 300+ page manuscript and submitted it to Princeton Press. And I got back a sort of favorable first report, but it was being treated as a word study, as something that was just going through looking at words as Herodotus uses various first-person words. And I had failed completely for this reader to talk about the excitement of what I was seeing. I was really very, very on fire with a Bakhtinian idea of how Herodotus takes the logoi of others and using his own voice as the sort of net that would capture these in a linear form. I just was very excited about it, and the work was being taken as a kind of obedient, rather tedious piece of work. So I had withdrawn it from publication. But when Debbie asked me to do an article, by the urging of my good friend Anne Berggren, a wonderful classicist who died last year, and I miss her very much. But Anne said, you've got to do this. You've got to get out there and put your ideas out in front of an audience. That will help you. So I wrote up this thing, and it was one of the, number of articles or number of things that became articles. I made the friendship of people who've stayed my friends my whole life. John Marincola and I discovered that we'd been working on the same things. I met Rosaria Munson. I met many other people who have since become friends through that conference. So that's the origin of this article. It's really 3 shoeboxes worth of Herodotean first persons. And the only thing I want to add is my thoughts after that. I'm a little uncomfortable with the article as it stands, although it's fine. It was the best I could do at the time, certainly. If my later thoughts are better expressed in a thing I did in the Brill volume that Egbert Bakker, Irina de Jong, and Hans von Wies put out. And there the one that I referred to at the beginning of the paper, I didn't give my own genealogy. Because what's probably most powerful in that article, in the later one, is footnote 13, where I say what I understood by that point and hadn't understood in 1987 is that this material is entirely, I guess the word I use is labile, but it's able to be employed in many different ways to answer many different questions, all of which are legitimate, but none of which can dominate, none of which can be the last word in the use of the narrative first person. So and there I simplify it somewhat in saying that there really are 2 modes that he promotes, one as a narrator and the other as what I call a histor. Because what I saw, and I don't think I saw clearly in 87, was that Herodotus's voice, even as an onlooker, but certainly in the other 3 voices I talk about, the eyewitness investigator and the critic and the editor, the writer, all of these are ways that he employs those voices, and they can be distinguished in the way I distinguished them in 87, but he employs all of them, even the voice of the onlooker, as ways of showing us that at base here, there is not just his performance and his ideas, his judgment, but there is, he intends, something that comes as close as possible to being history, to being a real story, to being as close as a human being can come to accounting for the stuff that has happened in communities, and in both authors, communities in collision in the 5th century BCE, although Herodotus, of course, starts a lot before that. So that has been one of my major obsessions as a person who teaches Greek and Latin and loves the Greek and Roman authors. And at the moment, I think the most valuable thing for me in all these years of thinking about that sort of thing has been the 15-year project that Rosaria Munson and I have been doing. We're about, I think, God willing, within a year or at most in the 2nd year, we will come out with our book 1, Herodotus, from Cambridge University Press in the Green and Yellow series, because we had great fun. Rosaria is another person who's worked for a very long time looking at how Herodotus constructs, especially his ethnographic voice, his interest in other peoples. But we've tried to put together something that a student could use both to get help with, starting to work on Herodotus and getting exposure to this absolutely remarkable mind. He's just one of the great world geniuses, I think, in coming up with something like the history. And it's astonishing to me that I've been working pretty carefully on this text for 40 years or so, and I still find him fascinating. I'm still being startled by the stuff that I come up with.